Thank you so much. It's good to be with you this morning. It's always good to look at the scriptures together. It's especially good to do so during the month, a little longer than that, the season of Lent, and look at the cross. And as we journey towards Easter together, remember what it is that we are celebrating, what it is that we are remembering as we remember our humanness, and our weakness, and our deep need for our Father and what He's done for us. And so last week, we began a new series called The 7 Words from the Cross. And Aaron began this series for us by talking about the first word from the cross, which is, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. And so this morning, we're going to continue in our series by taking a look at the second word from the cross. And the second word it's a word that is given as a word of comfort and hope. And it's spoken to a very unlikely character. And so this morning I want to invite you to stand with me as we continue to look at these words from the cross. Our passage this morning comes from Luke chapter 23, verses 36 to 43. The passage says, "The soldiers also mocked him. They came up to him, offering him sour wine, and saying, 'If you really are the King of the Jews, save yourself.' Above his head was a notice of the formal charge against him. It read, 'This is the King of the Jews.' One of the criminals hanging next to Jesus insulted him, 'Aren't you the Christ? Save yourself and us.' Responding, the other criminal spoke harshly to him, 'Don't you fear God, seeing that you have also been sentenced to die? We are rightly condemned, for we are receiving the appropriate sentence for what we did. But this man has done nothing wrong.' Then he said, 'Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom.' Jesus replied, 'I assure you that today you will be with me in paradise.'" Thanks be to God for His word. You may be seated this morning. So a couple of years ago, it's been a while now, probably five or 6 years ago now. Wow, I'm getting old. But my friends and I, we binge watched a show called Lost. I don't know if you've seen the show Lost, but we binge watched Lost on Netflix. And so we were obsessed with the show. And if you don't know anything about Lost, it's based on a group of people that crash in an airplane, and they have to figure out life on an unknown island. And so it was one of those shows that as soon as one episode ends, you just really want to go to the next episode and what happens. Lots of cliffhanger endings, lots of plot twists, good character development. It was one of my favorite shows. We loved it. And so we spent lots of our summer nights that year watching this show. We probably watched seasons at a time far too quickly than we should have. But we really enjoyed our summer that year watching Kate and Saeed and Sawyer, Jack, try to figure out life on the island. And whether you've seen this show or not is really not important, but what is important is how the show ends. I think we all like good endings, right? That's a pretty safe assumption. And so a good ending can really make or break any TV show or movie or book that we might be reading. And many people who watch the show Lost would have had a similar response, I think, to the ending. Maybe one critique, if you love the show, was it really didn't have a good ending. It kind of left you hanging at the end. It kind of made you wonder, what were those first 6 seasons really all about? What did I watch? And so if you have theories about how it ended, I love the show, but I'd love to hear your thoughts about the ending afterwards this morning. But it did end with a lot of questions, not a lot of resolution. And so I think that is true that with any of us. When we watch any movie or TV show, one of the critiques that we can have is about how it concludes. We hear people say all the time, "Well, I like that movie, but I really didn't care for the way that it ended. It was kind of a disappointing ending." And so how something ends is incredibly important to us. And so it's so important that sometimes we even prefer to sometimes skip to a good ending if we don't care for maybe the conflict or the tension that's happening in the middle of the story. We like to know that there is some resolution, that something good is going to come of whatever's happening in the story. And so sometimes we rush past that conflict to get to a good ending, because what's in the middle sometimes makes us uncomfortable or makes us squirm a little bit. And so this morning I want to say that I think that that's why Lent is such an important season for us. That we know that Easter is such an incredible ending, but at the same time we can say theologically that Easter is just the beginning for us as Christians. But it's that ending of knowing that resurrection is coming, hope is given, and those kinds of things. So we rush past some of the conflict of the cross to get to this wonderful ending of resurrection at Easter. But there's so much for us in these words from the cross that we're looking at to remind us of who we are and what we need and who God is and how much He loves us. And so that's what this sermon series is for, and what Lent is for, is to make us fully appreciate what the cross means. And so that's why we're looking at it this morning. And so our passage today, in our passage we meet a couple of criminals. And these are criminals that were subject to the same kind of death that Christ was. And we're told that this first criminal joins in the mocking and the sarcasm that's already being poured on Jesus by those standing near him and by the soldiers. And it's actually pretty amazing that this criminal goes out of his way while dying this miserable death himself to insult Jesus and to slander him in these ways when he himself is dying the same way. You kind of get the idea that this is kind of a miserable character himself. But on the other side of Jesus is another criminal. And this man's final words are very different than the words of the first criminal. For whatever reason, he chooses to defend Jesus. And somehow he knows Jesus' story. He knows who he is. And he tells this other criminal, he says, "Don't you fear God?" And he says, "You know we're only up here because we deserve this. As criminals, we're getting what we deserve, but this man is innocent. He's done nothing wrong." And so it would have been remarkable if he would have stopped there, and it would have been something if he would have just stopped at defending Jesus, but he goes on from there. And he says, "Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom. Remember me when you come into your kingdom." And on the surface, these words may not seem significant. Maybe they're just something that he says in that moment. But as I look at this passage this week, I'm convinced that these words say something pretty profound to us about what this man thinks of Jesus. He's telling us who he thinks that Jesus is. He's answering a question that we all have to answer. Who is Jesus? And depending on who you ask that question today, you'll get a variety of different answers still today. And it was not that different 2,000 years ago. For Jesus' disciples, they'd come to know him as a teacher or a rabbi, and they've come to see him as a teacher that they've come to see as a Messiah. They believe that he really is the king that is coming. And then for the teachers of the law and these Jewish leaders, Jesus has become a problem. Jesus has become a threat because he's undermining their power and their authority. And then for the Romans, Jesus has become this nuisance and this problem that needs to be dealt with and done away with. And so depending on who you ask the question, who is Jesus? You're met with a very different response. And that's where this gets interesting this morning when we talk about this criminal. Because in our passage, we're told that above Jesus' head was a sign. We're told that this sign was intended to state the crime for which the person is being executed. And this crime says that Jesus is King of the Jews. And it's written in 3 languages, so everybody sees it, everybody reads it. But we know from reading the story that not everybody thinks that Jesus is a king. Clearly not everybody thinks that Jesus is actually a king. In fact, the Jewish leaders would have preferred that the sign had read that Jesus merely claimed to be a king, that he was actually a false king. And so the irony this morning is found in who actually recognizes Jesus as king. Because by asking Jesus to remember him when he comes into his kingdom, the criminal is believing that Jesus really does have a kingdom. And he's declaring that he really does believe that Jesus is a king. And so it's crazy to think about the fact that this criminal dying on the cross, the same death that Jesus is dying, has found the faith to believe in a dying king's kingdom. That's pretty incredible. And Jesus rewards this incredible faith and invites him to be a part of his kingdom. But the fact that this criminal recognizes Jesus as king is still upside down in a lot of ways. Because imagine if you were one of Jesus' followers. You followed him. Maybe you're one of his 12. Maybe you're Jesus' mother. And you've been with him. And now you're here and you're watching this happen. You're watching the crucifixion. And you can only imagine, and we can only imagine, what it would have been like to watch him go through that and to be one of those followers. They thought that they knew who Jesus was. They thought that he was this king that was coming, that was everything that they were waiting for. And now you're watching him die, wondering if maybe Jesus wasn't who you thought that he was. You've got these bits of doubt creeping into your mind. And so in that moment, it would have made so much sense for Jesus to have had some kind of words of comfort or hope for those who were closest to him, something to assure them. But as we quickly learn, as we read through the Gospels, Jesus likes to turn things upside down. He doesn't always do what we expect. And Jesus offers hope and comfort to someone in this story, but it's not those closest to him. He turns instead to this criminal next to him, the most unlikely of characters, and he offers his grace and his salvation. And if we know Scripture, this is exactly the kind of thing that we should have come to expect from Jesus. We know that Jesus himself associated himself with prostitutes and with dishonest tax collectors. Jesus makes room in his kingdom for children, makes room in his story for children that didn't have a place in that society. He embraced people that culture held at an arm's length, like the poor and the sick. And so Jesus was a friend to these people that were on the fringes, the marginalized. And so this morning, we should not be shocked, but we are kind of shocked that Jesus spends these closing moments of his life doing the same kind of things that he spent his life and his ministry doing. Talking to criminals, giving hope to the hopeless. And that was the main complaint against Jesus in that moment, right? Is that he spent time with the wrong kinds of people. And so it seems only appropriate then that he would also die with those same people. And so this interaction that we have between Jesus and our criminal this morning is a powerful one. But as I was looking at this passage this week, I had to wonder, what does it mean for us? What does it speak to us during the season of Lent as we move towards Easter? I've always thought of the thief on the cross to be one of the most mysterious characters in Scripture, mostly because we really don't know much about him other than what we see in this passage right here, and yet he's such a central figure to such an important passage in our Bible. But I think the one thing that we can say about him for sure is that he met Jesus in the most desperate moment of his life. He met Jesus in the most desperate moment of his life. My son Owen's first birthday is in 2 weeks. So it's been fun to watch him grow, to watch him change, to watch him learn new things, to try new things, to just be crazy and enjoy life as he does. And so we've learned some things about him. And one of those things is that he does not seem to have a healthy understanding of fear or like self-preservation or those kinds of things. One of his favorite things to do is to climb to the highest place that he can get to and then just like roll off or like jump or do something crazy. So he keeps his mom and dad on his toes. We're always trying to catch him and those kinds of things. But there are times with Owen that we just don't know what he needs. And we call those moments meltdown moments. And in those moments, we have a list, and we just go down that list of what could he need? Could he be hungry? Could he be thirsty? Does he need his diaper changed? Do his teeth hurt? There's like a million different things that he could need. And so if mom is going through the list of things, usually we get to a solution a little bit faster. If dad's going through the list, usually the first or second thing on the list is go get mom and see if she knows what he needs. And so we've learned, some things along the way, but sometimes, even after we've gone through that list and we're trying to decide what it is that Owen needs, we just look at each other and we're like, I don't know what he needs. Like, I don't know why he's upset or why he won't stop screaming or something like that. So, but just like that, I think that there are times for us, for ourselves, that we don't always know what we need. We've gone down our list of things that should help, that should make us feel better, that should give us hope, and sometimes we find that we are at the end of our rope. And we find ourselves in a situation that is similar to the criminal that's on the cross. And we're not dying the kind of death that he's dying. We're not in his shoes. But sometimes we get to a place where we feel like we are without hope. And we are hanging on by a thread. And we've reached the end of our rope. And so this morning I want to say that this criminal has something to teach us. Because in his moment of desperation, he simply asks Jesus to remember him. He's identified that Jesus is a king, and he wants to be a part of that king's kingdom. And he says, Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom. And we have to realize that this thief probably means eventually. He, in that moment, probably may not realize what Jesus is about to tell him. He probably thinks that, someday, Jesus, down the line, when you really do become king and have this kingdom, remember me. But then Jesus surprises him by saying, I assure you that this very day you will be with me in paradise. And so this morning I want to say to us that I think that we have a hard time thinking about paradise as something that is hope for us today. I think we think that paradise is something that we equate sometimes with heaven, something that we experience someday, off in a distant future, but not today. That paradise is not something that we experience during this life. And paradise is a hard thing for us to define, I think, to understand what that looks like. We have our images of what paradise might be with, island paradise. Maybe, I don't know what paradise is for you. Maybe it's a spring day coming up in Busch Stadium. You're sitting there enjoying paradise, watching the Cardinals beat the Cubs, something like that. Coldplay sings about paradise. So we have these different ideas of what paradise might be. But for us this morning, I think there is a quote that can be helpful for us as we think about paradise. Will Willimon says, paradise is whenever and wherever you are with Jesus. I want to say that one more time. Paradise is whenever and wherever you are with Jesus. And he goes on to say, while Christians expect that the relationship will be deeper, richer, and more full once we've passed beyond the frustrations and limitations of this present mortal life, that does not mean that that relationship does not begin here and now. And so we can say that it was at this moment when this criminal recognized that Jesus was king that he transitioned into paradise in that moment when he began that relationship with Jesus. It's hard for us to equate, I think, any of our present circumstances to what that criminal is going through in that moment. He's definitely had better days. To say that is an understatement of all understatements. But this story still proves for us that in the darkest moments of our life, we can be with Jesus. He can be beside us in those moments. In spite of his situation that day, our criminal received good news. And in his worst circumstances, he met a king and he was offered grace and comfort and began paradise with Jesus. And so this morning, I am convinced that this passage is in our Bible. Luke wrote it down for us because it's not just good news for that criminal, but it's good news for us as well, and good news for everyone. Because like the thief on the cross, if we're honest, we know our guilt. We know that we are not innocent. But the good news this morning is that the gospel is that while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. And so this morning, in this season of Lent, as we journey towards the cross and Good Friday together, not pushing past that conflict of this somewhat awkward story that lends itself to maybe want us to push past that and get to Easter, we remember its meaning for us. We have the opportunity, just like the criminal did, to consider our answer to the question, who is Jesus? Is he really this king? And if he really is a king, is he our king? Have we allowed him to be king in our life? And this morning we can find comfort in the fact that God is a God who is eager to remember us in our moments of desperation. And that in the darkest moments of life, he invites us into a paradise that is a life with him. And that we can know that not only is Jesus king, but he's a good king that opens the door to all. That all are invited to come in, even the most unlikely. And that in that kingdom, we can find a life with Jesus that begins today, that can be described as a paradise, both in this life and in the life that is to come. This is good news for the criminal this morning. This is good news for us. And so this morning we are so thankful for the gospel that Jesus brought to us. Would you stand with me as we close?